Good day. Today is Monday, 26th November, and I'm going to focus again today on the crisis in Ukraine. Obviously, this is the major topic of discussions in international affairs at the moment. I want to stress it's not the only thing that's going on in the world. There are lots of other things going on in the world, in the Middle East, in Sudan, in all sorts of places like that. But it is, I think, still the most important single crisis that we face now, the one where we have been brought to the absolute brink of total disaster with an inability on the part of many Western leaders, or so it seems to me, to understand this. Now, before I proceed to review or cover the various other things that have been happening in the world, I just wanted to say, and indeed in the crisis in Ukraine, I just wanted to say that I'm going to return briefly to the topic of the Oreshnik strike. In my program yesterday, I discussed at length Professor Theodore Postol's opinions about the nature of the strike and the nature of the Oreshnik weapon itself. He suggested that at least my understanding of what he was suggesting is that what the Russians deployed against Dnipro, against the giant Yuzhmash factory in Dnipro, was a hypersonic glide vehicle. Now, there is an alternative theory, which I've seen from another engineer who does a program called on a channel called Millennium 7, and he seems to agree with Professor Postol on many things. I want to stress, if there is a difference of opinion, it is a difference of opinion between people who know what they're talking about and are working with limited amounts of information. Anyway, this engineer, I'm afraid I don't know his name, but he clearly is well informed about these matters. He suggested that the Oreshnik is an adaptation of the sea-launched ballistic missile carried by Russian nuclear submarines, the Bulava, which is indeed an extremely advanced missile indeed, and which, as I happen to know, can operate using very flat trajectories, making it more difficult to intercept with the normal type of anti-ballistic missile system. And again, I have to say that just as I found Professor Postol's explanations very plausible and convincing, I found this engineer's explanations very plausible and convincing as well. There's two things I want to say. The first is that as I have no engineering or science background of any kind, I'm not going to make any attempt to decide this issue between them. And the second thing is that I don't see that it makes any significant difference, because whatever the system used, whatever the the vehicle, the precise nature of the missile used, whether it was a hypersonic glide vehicle or an adaptation of the extremely advanced Bulava sea-launched ballistic missile, in either case, the capability is the same. Hypersonic vehicle or missile attacking a target with using multiple kinetic warheads, probably equipped with this very powerful Hextol derivative explosive that I've talked about, able to conduct massive damage on a target, a system that is immune to interception and which ultimately achieves the same effect, whether it's a glide vehicle or an adaptation of the Bulava system. Both, by the way, exceptionally advanced, cutting-edge machines And, well, we've seen the effectiveness of this particular system as it's been deployed, as it's been deployed on the battlefronts. Now, the one thing I would say is that because the Bulava is a well-established system, I believe it entered service in 2018, or at least it began to be installed in Boré-class submarines in 2018, though I understand that it officially only entered service with the Russian armed forces a few weeks ago. But because it is a well-established system, if the Oreshnik is indeed a derivative of the Bulava, then placing it in series production should not be especially complicated, because of course the production line for the Bulava already exists. And I would add that in that case we are probably able to identify the name of the designer. Most probably it is Yuri Solomonov, who is a celebrated figure in Russia. He is the head of the Moscow Institute of Thermal Energy, the institute that designs Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles and other types of missiles. He's a celebrated or famous scientist and undoubtedly one of the world's greatest rocket scientists. And he is, of course, the person who designed the Bulava system, and after a very, very complicated and difficult test program, eventually brought it to fruition. So we probably in that case have the name of the designer as well. But anyway, as I said, I don't know which it is, whether it's a thermal, hypersonic glide vehicle or a derivative of the Bulava system. In either case, as I said, the capabilities of the system would appear to be roughly the same. So let's move on and discuss how the Western powers, or at least the European powers, are responding to these events. And there's been an incredible and I think extremely astonishing article in Le Monde, French newspaper, if you like, the newspaper of record in France, one that is undoubtedly close to President Macron's government. Anyway, Le Monde says, in effect, that Britain and France have been in discussions together and that they're again discussing the possibility of sending ground forces to Ukraine. And the French Foreign Minister, Monsieur Barrot, effectively said the same thing the other day. I mean, he didn't quite put it like that, but he too said that France did not exclude the possibility of sending ground troops to the combat zone. Now, I have to say that I find this astonishing. I find this so reckless and irresponsible as to be, well, not only incredibly dangerous, but at some level even demented. The British military, by every possible account, is in a very poor condition. The size of the British armed forces has been sharply reduced. Even as all of these announcements and discussions are being made, the British Ministry of Defence has had to give up or cancel various existing warships, 2 amphibious warfare carriers, a frigate, some other systems. It's had to take them out of service because there is insufficient funding to bring them back to a state of repair or to find crews for them. I've heard that the deployable force of the British Army is around 20,000 men. The French military is said to be in a rather better condition overall, but again, the French military is in no position by itself to take on the Russians. One assumes that if there are really plans, there are really discussions about sending some sort of expeditionary force to Ukraine, then the idea, presumably, is to base it around the French, with the British providing some kind of military support and being there in order to convey to the world the appearance that this is a joint enterprise of these two countries, some kind of coalition, if you like. To those of us who know our history, all I would say is that it's not the first time that the British and the French together have sent expeditionary forces to Russia to fight Russia. The first time they did that was in the 1850s, in the 1854 to be precise, when a British-French expeditionary force fought the Russians in the Crimean War. And the second time something rather similar happened was during the Russian Civil War at the tail end of the First World War, when the British and the French also sent troops to Russia, in theory to try to protect Allied interests, in fact, to some extent, to help the whites in the Civil War against the Bolsheviks, and generally to interfere in Russian domestic affairs in ways that, by the way, were bitterly unpopular, certainly in Britain at that time. And for the record, and for those who are interested in these things, in 1939, 1940, during the so-called Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union, at a time when Britain and France were, of course, already at war with Germany in the Second World War, the British and the French also planned to send an expeditionary force to Finland to fight the Soviet Union, in other words, Russia, there as well. Fortunately, Finland capitulated before it could arrive. So, as I said, this is not a new idea. It is one of those incredibly bad ideas that is revived every so often. Suffice to say that whenever it has been attempted, the results have always been bad. I appreciate that according to the official view, the Crimean War ended in a Western victory and a Russian defeat. My own view is that in military terms, it was at best a draw, and the objectives that the Allies had prior to the Crimean War came nowhere close to being achieved, despite the enormous, exorbitant costs that Britain and France had to fight in that war. Anyway, I'm not going to say more about this. This is a complex topic, perhaps for another time. The First World War intervention was, of course, a complete and abject failure, one which made, however, relations between the Russians and the Allied powers more complicated and difficult than they might otherwise have been. Anyway, there we are. So, an incredibly bad idea, cobbled together by two governments, two deeply unpopular governments, each of which appears to be risking a massive backlash from their public opinions to send incredibly inadequate forces to Ukraine in order to do, well, what exactly? Because the plan, what the actual military objective is, I'm really not sure. Well, the fact that this plan apparently exists may provide, in fact probably does provide, a further explanation for that completely bizarre Ministry of Defence, British Ministry of Defence briefing that I discussed yesterday. It spoke in really rather agitated terms, at least I found them a bit agitated, about how the Russian plan to develop a modern, professional, all-volunteer army had supposedly been derailed by the war in Ukraine, and it was this which explained why the Russians had failed to achieve, supposedly, the various objectives that they had for themselves in Ukraine. Now, looking back, to me now, following this Le Monde article, I now lean to the view that British Ministry of Defence briefing reflects internal arguments that are taking place within the British political and military establishment. I suspect that there are some British military officers who are telling ministers, the ministers who are promoting this idea, you are out of your minds. What are you thinking? Do you really believe that an expeditionary force made up of a few thousand troops can change the course of a war in which the Russian military perhaps now numbers around 1 million? And some advocate of this plan, if it is a plan, this idea, has written a rather tetchy briefing to be published and made public by the Ministry of Defence, telling everybody, well, actually, there really isn't any serious cause for concern because the Russian army is poorly trained, inefficient, badly run, conscripted, a mass army of the old sort, whereas our army, on the contrary, is professional, highly trained, extremely well organised, very motivated. It will be no contest. The Russians will quickly lose. Well, or as I said yesterday that I found this British Ministry of Defence briefing update frankly bizarre. I still think so. I hope there is indeed a debate going on, because again, this seems to me a completely ludicrous idea. And of course, it's been made even more ludicrous by the Oreshnik strike, irrespective of whether this was a hypersonic glide vehicle or an adaptation of the Bulava sea-launched ballistic missile. The engineer on this channel, Millennium 7, who was of the view that the Oreshnik could be an adaptation of the Bulava. He went through possible list of targets that the Russians might attack in the event that things were to continue to escalate in the conflict and the British and the French were to become involved, so that the Russians decided to use the Oreshnik against them. And obviously the Oreshnik could be used against concentrations of British and French troops in Ukraine itself, or it could be used against other targets. And I noticed that one of them was the British base in Akrotiri in Cyprus. I should add that if there is an attack on the Akrotiri base, it'll obviously have a major impact on public opinion in Cyprus and Greece as well, not to mention what the views in Britain would be. Anyway, Coming to that last point, we are at the moment in Britain in a situation where the government's popularity, this is a government that was only elected a few months ago, the government's popularity is sinking fast. The Prime Minister has seen his popularity collapse. I believe he was at plus 34 favourable immediately after the election when he became Prime Minister, and I believe that's fallen to a negative rating of 11. In other words, a complete collapse in his popularity. There is, as I'm talking about this, a petition circulating in Britain in which around 2 million people have supposedly already signed to say that they want a new election immediately. Obviously, there isn't any plan for one. But the government is unpopular. The business community is now worried about the economy. They're critical. They're becoming increasingly critical of the government's recent budget. And there is reason to think that inflation is rising and Britain is on the brink of another recession. And in France, the mood is no better. There also, the economic conditions are difficult. The new government set up by Michel Barnier, picked unexpectedly by Emmanuel Macron to be France's Prime Minister, is trying to get its budget through the French National Assembly. It has, however, fallen out with Marine Le Pen and the Rassemblement National. Some are linking this to an attempted prosecution of Marine Le Pen connected to campaign financing laws. I think it is much more likely that with public opinion across France hardening against the budget, the Rassemblement National has concluded that there is no political and electoral benefit for them in continuing to pull Macron's and Barnier's coals out of the fire. So they look like they're going to oppose the budget. There's apparently talk about doing so. But if the budget fails, there's likely to be a vote of confidence in the Barnier government. The left in France are apparently proposing a vote of no confidence in Barnier's government, and they're the largest group in the French National Assembly. If the Rassemblement National joins them, there will be a majority. The Barnier government will be voted out of office, and Barnier himself will have to resign. Now, I understand that Le Pen and the Rassemblement National are saying that if that happens, then they will demand that Macron resign also. They will say that France, under his leadership, has in effect become ungovernable, that he has lost the confidence of the French people, as shown by the recent European and parliamentary elections, that his machinations have left France with an unstable government which is unable to form a proper coalition, and they're demanding that Macron resign and that there should be new presidential elections called, presidential elections which will be, I believe, around 2 years before their time. And I understand that the left also is essentially saying the same thing. So, in the midst of this crisis, a political crisis, which is, by the way, certain to eventually evolve into an economic crisis if it continues, there are suggestions that if the situation continues in the way that it has done, then we could see pressure on France in the international financial markets, the markets becoming increasingly concerned about the sustainability of France's debt, yields on French bonds starting to get higher, grow higher, further strains on the government's financing. I've even seen suggestions that there could be an all-out fiscal crisis. Well, we'll see. But anyway, one way or the other, it's very, very difficult to see how this political crisis can end tidily or well. So, this is exactly the right time to send a French expeditionary force to Russia to fight, to Ukraine to fight the Russians. After all, this is the same territory where Napoleon came to grief and where others came to grief as well. So why not, in the middle of a governmental and political and potentially economic crisis, try the same thing all over again? What could possibly go wrong? Well, it's not, of course, just the French and the British who are in serious difficulties. Again, about 2 days ago, I was reading an article in the Financial Times, another in an almost unending series of articles now, about the state of another major European economy, the German economy. That, too, is in growing difficulties. I was reading in that article about the growing gloom that there is in Germany, about the decline of Germany's industrial base, the fact that the crisis in the German economic system seems to be reaching, industrial system seems to be approaching the point of no return. Again, the perfect moment for the new Chancellor of Germany in February, Friedrich Merz, to start helping the Ukrainians to launch missile strikes against Russia. Again, Germany, in effect, involving itself in precisely the same area of conflicts that it found itself in during the First and Second World Wars, against the same enemy who comprehensively defeated Germany in 1945, and doing so in the midst of an economic crisis, quite plausibly a political crisis. Again, what could possibly go wrong in a situation like this? And yet, that is the kind of thinking that we seem to see in Europe at the moment. Not actually sit down and talk to the Russians, not acknowledge the underlying realities of the situation on the battlefronts, which I'll come to later, except that the situation is now played out, that the Ukrainian front lines are indeed on the brink of collapsing. Double, triple, quadruple down, just go on recklessly gambling, taking incredible and extraordinary risks, and ultimately, and this is the key to understanding what all of these people are thinking, ultimately tell yourself that there's no real reason to worry, because if things do go badly wrong, the United States, even under President Donald Trump, is obliged to come to Britain and France and Germany's rescue. Because this is what this plan about sending troops to Ukraine all along has always been about. Well, I have to say that is a bad plan from every conceivable point of view. For example, if the United States does it, then we could find ourselves at a genuine risk of a war with Russia, a real NATO-Russia war, with the consequences that have been discussed many times. It could easily spiral into a world war, a nuclear war. in which the very survival of humanity might be at risk. Or it could be that the United States will intervene, but only in a half-hearted and limited way, given that the Russians have demonstrated capabilities that no one imagined, as with the Oreshnik strike, and who knows what other weapons they might possess, in which case the scale of the defeat that we are already looking at in Ukraine, the scale of that defeat, will be further compounded. Or there is another possibility, and this possibility has been highlighted in a recent article written in Responsible Statecraft by Anatol Lieven, who I've not always agreed with, by the way, over the course of this conflict, but who usually, and in this case, writes with great insight and good sense. And, well, he also makes the entirely obvious and valid point. What is the British government doing? It specifically addresses the British government, but the same could apply to the French and German governments, or at least in Germany, not perhaps the government so much as the CDU, Friedrich Merz and co. What do they think they're doing in the last weeks of an administration in Washington, which will soon be out of the way? How do they think Donald Trump and his team will respond to all of these maneuvers and intrigues and things that they are indulging themselves in? And do they really imagine that doing all of these things, these incredibly dangerous and reckless things, is going to make Donald Trump specifically more favourable to them? I'm going to read parts of this article because I think it makes the point so well. And this article, as I say, was written before the Oreshnik strike. It was written before the Storm Shadow strike in Kursk, though after the British media had published confirmation that the decision had already been made by the British government to facilitate Ukrainian Storm Shadow strikes against the Russians in Kursk, in other words, in Russia itself. And anyway, these are some of the things that Anatol Lieven says. In keeping with most British military decisions, and he puts the word decisions in quotation marks, its actions follow the Biden administration's approval to allow Ukraine to use its own long-range ATACMS missiles in the same way. The British government seems to have forgotten that 2 months from now, the Biden administration will no longer be in office, and the Trump White House may not take kindly to what some of its future members see as British support for a preemptive Biden attempt to wreck Trump's peace agenda in Ukraine. We'll come to that in a moment. From the point of view of Britain's own security interests, which do not appear to play any part in British establishment thinking about Ukraine, and he's talking here specifically about British interests, British citizens just have to hope that after January, the Russian government does not retaliate against the United Kingdom, for if it does, they may not receive much sympathy from Washington. The official argument for the ATACMS and Storm Shadow's decisions is to put Ukraine in a stronger position before peace talks are initiated by Trump. Russia seems certain to try to gain as much territory as possible before these talks begin, and the Ukrainian armed forces are in serious danger of collapse. This is a dangerous gamble because the missiles, which are guided to their targets by US personnel, risk infuriating Russia without giving really critical help to Ukraine. Now, that, I think, is one of the most important points to keep in mind. This extraordinary step of authorizing missile strikes against Russia is a step which, exactly as Anatol Lieven says, will infuriate, in fact has infuriated Russia, but it is not giving any really critical help to Ukraine. It cannot do. I will discuss shortly the actual military situation in Ukraine in a moment. And Anatol Lieven then goes on to say it is especially dangerous for the United Kingdom because if Putin feels impelled to live up to his promises to retaliate without attacking US interests and alienating Trump, he could well feel that the United States makes a safer target. It is at least a gamble on Putin's part, based on rational calculations. And then Anatol Lieven goes on to say that the British, at least in public, continue to insist on the importance of some sort of victory over Russia in Ukraine, as if this is remotely achievable now, and that this is enormously risky, that it risks causing Trump to feel that the British, along with the Biden administration, are deliberately sabotaging his peace agenda, which, as Anatol Lieven correctly says, would be hugely damaging to the American-British relationship and could potentially put Britain in an extremely exposed position. And Anatol Lieven also absolutely correctly says that all of these articles, which are now starting to appear in the American and, by the way, British media, about how all of these moves by the Biden administration, by the British, by the French, by all of the others to help Ukraine are somehow intended to Trump-proof aid to Ukraine. That's only going to make Trump even more sure that ultimately all of this is directed against him. And Lieven that goes on to say that the British and the French do not have the resources to sustain a war against the Russians, even assuming it doesn't take a nuclear turn. The European defence industries have no ability to crank up production to match Russian levels at any time, at any proximate time. He says that they could, in theory, buy weapons from the Americans, but, as he puts it, only if Washington is capable of supplying systems for Ukraine and Israel, and adequately supplying its own forces for possible war with China. And he omitted to mention Taiwan, but Taiwan is now a major buyer of American weapons, as, by the way, is South Korea, I believe, and various other countries. And he goes on to say, is it likely that a Trump administration, angered by a Ukrainian and European rejection of a peace deal, would prioritize weapons for Ukraine, even if the Europeans were paying for them? And then he goes on to say, the utterly confused state of British and European thinking about the military realities of the Ukrainian conflict and Europe's role is in large part due to the pitiful ignorance of military matters on the part of politicians and therefore governments who, with the rarest of exceptions, have never served in the military themselves or bothered to study military issues or devote serious study to any foreign country. That makes them completely dependent on advice from their foreign and security establishments, and for decades now these establishments have outsourced to Washington, which means, by the way, the think tanks in Washington, not just responsibility for their national security, but also their thinking about it. Well, he says an awful lot of other things. He resorts to some rather colourful metaphors, which I'm going to skip. But anyway, this is the point he's making is absolutely correct. You never go to war based on this woolly thinking that the British and Macron and his people in France seem to be indulging themselves in. It's not as if every single calculation, it's not as if every single calculation about the Ukraine war, which has been made up to now, has turned out successful. On the contrary, they've all turned out wrong. On every occasion, the Russians have proved stronger, more resilient, more able to adapt to the challenges that they face than anybody previous to the war had anticipated. And by the way, that includes me. So why go on gambling? Why not go on taking more and more risks, given that every gamble taken up to now has come out short? It is baffling. It is absolutely extraordinary. But one does perhaps find some clues. There has been today in The Guardian another article by another supporter of Ukraine, somebody who clearly wants to press on with the war and with support for Ukraine for as long as possible. And this article, well, I'm not going to read it through, but basically, well, its title is "Who is Really Escalating the War in Ukraine? It Certainly Isn't the West," and it's by James Nixey, who leads the Russia-Eurasia program at Chatham House, which is Britain's leading think tank and debating centre. I would have thought someone like that would be more realistic than I feel he is, but anyway, there we are. Anyway, if you read through his article, what is wrong, everything that has gone wrong in the conflict in Ukraine up to now, has not been because there have been miscalculations by the West, because there's been double dealing by the West. The West has always acted in a totally impeccable way. The Russians have always been at fault for everything. But the reason we're losing is not because we miscalculated, because we've underestimated the other side's strength and overestimated our own. It is because we lack will. We don't have the will to provide Ukraine with all the weapons that Ukraine needs. We are providing weapons too slowly and in never enough quantity, and the result is that it's never enough and the Ukrainians always lose. And he goes on to suggest that Ukraine should have been provided with Western arms before the 2014 crisis, when of course it didn't want them. President Yanukovych and his officials at that time were seeking good relations with Russia, not bad relations with Russia. He then suggests that the weapons could have been supplied, if not quite that early, at some other time before the conflict began, blind to the fact that that would simply have meant that the conflict with Russia began earlier. And, of course, he demands what is in effect unlimited escalation now, without giving any thought to the lack of resources, to the fact that things might not be quite as easy as he appears to think, that producing main battle tanks and rockets and missiles and all of those things is challenging from an industrial point of view, let alone producing a weapon system comparable to the Oreshnik, whatever that is. Apparently that isn't a problem. It's all will. We just lack the will. We don't have the will to do this. We need instead to find the will, and all will be right. Just to give an example of the outlook, he says, I'm going to just quote these words. He talks about one of the reasons why the West has not provided Ukraine with all the weapons it wants. It would cost a lot more in defense spending, donations of weaponry, and keeping Ukraine's economy and society functioning. Wars are expensive. Democratic governments dependent on their electorates are loath to tell them this. As illustrated by the US election, incumbents who are in power when taxes and commodity prices are rising typically get voted out. So what exactly does he suggest? That we do away with elections? That we turn authoritarian, not fake authoritarian, the kind of authoritarian governments that in the West are called authoritarian, but which on examination turn out not to be. That we ourselves turn out authoritarian because people, electorates, cannot be trusted to go on paying more taxes, accepting higher prices, accepting lower living standards in order to keep Ukraine's economy and society functioning and to donate to it more weapons. One can already see the complete lack of reality and, frankly, the rather dangerous turn in this type of thinking and the unwillingness to face the underlying problems which have always been there and which have been foreseeable from the start. Anyway, there we are. That's where we are. We have this debate now, ongoing debate all over again about deploying European forces to Ukraine. Now, I don't think the Americans are going to back this. Even the Biden administration, I think, doesn't really want to back this. I think they understand very well that if they do, there is going to be a major crisis, political crisis in the United States. I think they know that Congress, the Republicans in Congress, will be strongly opposed. And I suspect that by now, at this stage in the conflict and following the election, there will be some Democrats who will speak out against it as well. After January, when we get a new Congress in place, I think the opposition would be even greater. And the Trump administration, or at least the Trump team, seem to be going out of their way to say, even the more hawkish elements amongst them, that they categorically rule out sending troops, US troops, to Ukraine. And again, I think that they understand that if they changed their stance on this, not only would there be problems in Congress, with a potential split in the Republican Party, but there would be issues, protests across US society. By the way, going back to the point just made by Mr. Nixie about the unwillingness of Western electorates to countenance war spending and sacrifice their living standards and economies and all the rest to the cause of Ukraine. I predict that if the Europeans were to send combat troops to fight the Russians in Ukraine, there would be major political protests and crisis as well. And as I've said, it looks as if we are on the cusp of a political crisis already in France. So, I don't think the Americans will go down this line. What we are still, all of us, however, waiting for is for some insight about what Donald Trump, the future president, is going to do. And his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, has now given an interview, I believe it was for Fox, which casts some light, but I have to say with that light there is also a great deal of fog. Now, the first thing that Mike Waltz said, well, he wasn't necessarily the first thing, but the thing that struck me is that he said that President Trump is very anxious, above all else, to de-escalate the situation. The situation is getting increasingly out of control. He realizes this, Trump does, and he wants to bring it back under control again. Now, that is a promising sign. That is a promising comment from Mike Waltz. And I'm going to disclose here that back in the summer, long before the election in November, we received information that was indeed Donald Trump's intention, that as President of the United States, he would seek a de-escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. Now, I ought to stress that we weren't sure at the time how authoritative or not that information was. The only reason I'm talking about it now is because Mike Waltz is using almost exactly the same language as we were informed of. We were provided when this was explained to us back in the summer. So it does look as if Donald Trump does want to see some sort of de-escalation. And we're also told that there is debate, that there is going to be a push to try to get the Ukrainians and the Russians negotiating with each other, that these are negotiations in which the Europeans apparently will also need to be involved. Now, that is complicated, and it does beg further questions, but all of this might be connected to reports of another peace conference, which supposedly is going to take place in Italy. The Italian government says that it wants to convene this peace conference, and this time the Russians supposedly are going to be invited. Now, that may not be quite as straightforward as Mike Waltz imagines. I suspect that the Russians will say, and it is understandable that they would, that from their point of view, they're not interested in a wider negotiation with outside parties. The negotiations that they want are directly with Ukraine, and separate negotiations on other matters with the United States. They are not prepared to engage in negotiations with, in effect, the entire collective West on this matter. And given that there have been missile strikes against Russia involving European countries, Britain and France, and given all the talk about sending European troops to Ukraine, that might be further reason why the Russians might say no. Lastly, Mike Waltz spoke about trying to re-establish deterrence. Now, this is a difficult concept. It's difficult to know exactly what he means by this, or what Trump means by this. Who exactly is being deterred here? We did a live stream earlier today on the Duran, with Brian Beletic of the New Atlas, and he made precisely that very point. What exactly does this word deterrence mean? Does it mean that there is some kind of equivalence between Russian actions and Western actions? Because the Russians will not accept that. And is it intended that they should be deterred from taking action in Ukraine that they consider to be vital in their own national interests? Because they might reject that kind of deterrence. Now, Rick Grenell, there are reports Rick Grenell is going to be the new envoy that Donald Trump is going to appoint. Perhaps his job is going to be to try to get the Ukrainians and the Russians talking to each other and to try to set up this peace conference in Italy. I think that he may find that it is much more difficult to persuade the Russians to change their approach on these issues than perhaps some people in the Trump team imagine. And I am not sure what happens if the Russians say no. Now, it is highly likely that they will. There is some talk from some people in the Trump team, including Mr. Gorka, who has just been appointed to some important position in the Trump team, that in that case the United States will go all out to support Ukraine. It will flood Ukraine with weapons, and it will try to toughen the sanctions regime on Russia. I think that any idea of toughening the sanctions regime on Russia will completely backfire. It will almost certainly exacerbate economic stresses across the world. It will lead to higher energy and fuel and food prices at a time when energy costs in Europe are again rising, when food prices globally also look like they're rising, and when there are signs that inflation may soon start growing again as well. On the contrary, the correct thing to do, and I've discussed this already, at this time, if some stabilization, not just of the European economy, but of the inflationary pressures in the United States is sought, is not to try to tighten the sanctions regime on the Russians. On the contrary, it is to relax it by allowing free or trade in Russian oil and gas products on global markets, making more oil and more gas available at lower prices, causing general energy prices to fall. But the key point anyway is that attempts to pressure the Russians economically are most unlikely to succeed, not just because the Russians have now had several years of proofing their economy against sanctions, but because it's become completely clear that the global south, the Chinese, the Indians, all the others, are not going to forego imports of Russian energy. This is too important for them to give up. And besides, in the case of both China and India and several other countries, several other key countries, it has now become an issue of sovereignty. If they start jeopardizing their trade with the Russians in that kind of way, then in effect, they're handing control of their economic future to the United States, and that is not something that they will want to do. So I think that the idea that you can simply toughen up sanctions beyond the incredible levels to which they have already gone is far-fetched. And of course, one can go down further routes. One can seize the Russian assets. That's quite possible. It's been discussed, but that will only take you so far. It's not as if the Russians have to have those assets in order to keep their economy growing. And of course, it's quite possible that in that case, if that step is done, the Russians will construe it as a further extremely hostile and unfriendly act, in which case, far from becoming more amenable, they're likely to harden their positions even further. That's putting aside what the global reaction to a seizure of Russian assets might be. So I don't think that this side of the calculus of pressure is really going to work. As for sending weapons, more weapons to Ukraine, what weapons? What weapons? More tanks, more armoured vehicles, more missiles? There is universally agreed to be a global shortage of air defence missiles, at least in the West. So stripping away remaining air defence missiles, sending them to Ukraine. Ukraine has already received lots and lots of air defence missiles. And how has it helped them? And in the meantime, of course, the military situation for Ukraine is deteriorating. And as Admiral Paparo, the commander of the US naval forces in the Indo-Pacific region, pointed out, as I discussed yesterday, diverting weapons to Ukraine out of existing US stockpiles is inevitably going to leave the United States more exposed in other places, specifically and especially against China. So I think that the Trump administration, if it is thinking of these dangerous plans, really needs to think very carefully and to say to itself, does it really want to go to these very dangerous points? Maybe, Rick Grenell can promote this idea of a peace conference in Italy, but I would suggest that in that case, the Trump administration makes an early decision not to invest too much political capital in it. Because, to be frank, I think by this point in the war, with the Russian army breaking through, with the Russians already deeply distrustful of whatever it is that the West has to say, I think the Russians are going to be deeply suspicious of any such peace proposal and will almost certainly reject it, and are probably increasingly thinking about some sort of military resolution to the war. That does not mean that efforts to resume some kind of dialogue between Russia and the United States cannot take place, but I think they need to be separated from the Ukraine issue. As for the Europeans, better leave them to sort themselves out, whilst making absolutely clear that if the British and the French want to go and fight the Russians in Ukraine, they're on their own. Anyway, there we are. I explored all of these issues at some length. Let me now turn to the military situation. And again, I'm going to do it rather quickly in avoiding some of the detail that I have on previous occasions, because it's clear that an awful lot has been going on while I've been in Budapest, and it's not easy to keep up with it. But I do want to say a few things about what's going on at the present time, because it's clear to me that things are now moving on the battlefields very, very fast. And this explains some of the fever that we are seeing in Western, especially European capitals. Just a couple of days ago, the BBC spoke about the possibility of Ukrainian defense lines collapsing. And it is clear to me that there is a general panic about this across the West, including on the part of the current administration in Washington. And it is this, even more than the pending arrival of Donald Trump, that explains this feverish atmosphere, this constant looking, searching around for some way of escalating which will finally bluff or force or bully the Russians into some sort of submission before the collapse, the final collapse in Ukraine comes. And if you go to the situation on the battlefronts, you can see this very quickly. The first thing to say is that yesterday evening, news came through that the Russian army has broken into the important fortified town of Velika Novosilka in southwestern Donbass. And Velika Novosilka, well, it's not perhaps as important as Ugledar and Kurakovo were, but it is said to be the last important fortified position that the Ukrainians possess in this part of the battlefronts east of the Dnieper River. Now, Velika Novosilka is a small place. Its maximum population in the 1980s, it once reached a population of around 8,000. I believe it is around 5,000 now. There are a number of rivers that run through it, so it's not perhaps the geography isn't especially simple, and that might facilitate defense to some extent. But the Russians are positioned to the east and north and south of Velika Novosilka, and they've also been making advances west of Velika Novosilka. The town is not completely surrounded, but it is relatively small. The garrison cannot be large. If the Russians have entered the town, I'm going to make a guess that at most fighting can only go on there for a few weeks, probably less than that, given the current battlefield conditions. So it looks like this town is going to fall. And that will unlock further large areas of territory for the Russians to capture as they advance west towards the Dnieper. In a sense, Velika Novosilka resembles Ocheretino, this village to the north of Avdiivka, which was seen by many people as a critically important fortified position that the Ukrainians had to hold. It was located on a hill. When the Russians captured Ocheretino far more rapidly than anybody expected, the entire defense line west of Avdiivka started to collapse, opening the way for the Russians to advance to Selidovo, Kurakovo, Novogrodivka, and of course Pokrovsk, where they currently are. And the fall of Velika Novosilka could plausibly have the same result, and it looks as if it is about to happen. Well, that's one critical area of the battlefields. There is more fighting taking place south and inside Kurakovo itself. The Russians appear to have, they have captured a village called Dalnie. There is apparently bitter fighting going on in a cluster of villages to the south of Kurakovo, where a Ukrainian force appears to be largely encircled. The Russians have apparently managed to clear several more of the villages west of Novomikhailovka, villages like Ilinka and Yelizavetivka and others. I believe the Ukrainians still have positions in some of these villages, but they're holding on by their fingernails, and it doesn't seem as if they're going to be there for very much longer. And if they do risk holding out there, they are at very serious risk after the fall of Danye of being surrounded. And in Kurakovo itself, the Russians are pushing the Ukrainians towards the western outskirts of this town, and they control the whole of the north of the Kurakovo reservoir. And there are reports that they've now captured the last village on the north banks of the reservoir, the village of Beretsky. They already controlled Ilinka and Nova Ilinka, north of the reservoir, and that they are approaching the village of Stary Terny, which is at the western end of the reservoir, which would, incidentally, leave the Ukrainian forces in Kurakovo, in effect, in a trap. So it's likely that this entire defense position from Velikaya Novosilka all the way to Kurakovo is close to some kind of collapse. And further north, just further north, in the area between Selidovo and Pokrovsk, apparently it has been a story of further Russian advances, that the Russians have been advancing rapidly west of Selidovo. Again, it's not entirely clear to me where they are now, but they appear to be in the process of surrounding a village some distance to the west of Selidovo called Pushkino, and the gradual advance, the westward advance of the Russians from Selidovo strongly suggests to me that what the Russians are preparing to do is some kind of wider encirclement operation of Pokrovsk. Now, Selidovo itself collapsed, not when the Russians attacked Selidovo head on. What the Russians did was that they moved to capture the villages to the south and north of Selidovo. Gradually they did it. They succeeded in doing it. That put the Ukrainian defenses in Selidovo in an impossible position, and Ukrainian defense in Selidovo at that point broke down. It looks to me as if the Russians are in the process of doing something similar on a bigger scale with Pokrovsk. And of course, they're also doing that with Kurakovo as well. Russian advances appear to be very fast. And we've also had reports, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal about the situation in Kursk, and a battalion commander with Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade, the brigade which is always sent in to plug the holes wherever it is found, they're found. Anyway, he says that the Russians are assaulting all the time, morning, day and night. I think they'll eventually push us back. They add more power and more resources, and they have a goal to reach the border at any cost. So they will do it. Russia has about 3 times as many men and 6 times as many drones. And Moscow is hammering the supply lines and storage facilities with glide bombs, which the Ukrainians have no way to shoot down. So, despite the storm shadow attacks and the ATACMS attacks, the situation in the Kursk pocket is deteriorating. There are reports that the Russians captured Plekhovo some days ago, just before I went to Budapest. They have now captured Darino. They are close In other words, to cutting off the main supply lines to the Kursk pocket. The Ukrainians are struggling to move along the main roads because of the ubiquitous presence of the Russian drones, and the ground conditions are so bad that it is difficult for them to move cross country. And reports speak of heavy fighting, with the Russians pushing through in central Chasiv Yar, heavy fighting in Toretsk as well. Everywhere, on every part of the battlefronts, the Russians continue their advances, and there are reports of further Russian advances in Zaporozhye region and of the preparations for a big offensive there. So it is a crisis. It is a military crisis. And one can no longer speak about the Ukrainians holding together defense lines. If Velikaya and Novosilka and Kurakhov fall, then it seems to me that what is left of Ukrainian defenses south of Pokrovsk will fully collapse, and the way will be open for the Russians to advance towards the Dnieper and indeed to enter Dnipro region, another region which up to this time the Russians have always accepted as fully Ukrainian. So this is the reality that is driving all the panic and hysteria across the West. Project Ukraine has failed. The Russians have won the war. Any and all attempts to reverse that will not only fail, but compound the already great disaster, great geopolitical disaster. I get the sense that Trump does at some level understand this and wants to end the war, but I wonder whether even he fully understands both the urgency and the complexity of doing that, and how difficult it might be if he lets himself get drawn into complex negotiations. As for the British and the French, they've taken leave of their senses, and I fear that the Germans have done so as well. Overall, what with the Oreshnik strike and all the rest, it is not a good or happy time. But anyway, we will see. We have a few more weeks left before Trump takes office, and then we will see what he does. Well, this is where I end today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.